All right, welcome everyone to the first South American grain market weather webinar conducted by CropProphet. For those that are new, CropProphet is one of two products offered by Prescient Weather, a weather information company based in Pennsylvania. The two products are CropProphet, and then we're actually going to see content today from our other product, the World Climate Service, which is a tool set designed to enable better long-range forecasting. And so today we're going to cover some of the weather conditions and look at the forecasts from the early portion of the South American grain season. If you do have questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A functionality within Zoom, not the chat functionality. If you use the Q&A, the question gets answered, and if I need to defer the question until later, I can answer you via email because I know who asked the question. And it also just helps us improve the outlooks overall. So for today's outlook and discussion, I'm going to focus on precipitation. And the reason is not that there aren't temperature risks or that there haven't been the occasional extreme temperature somewhere in Brazil or in Argentina. But really the goal of this webinar is just to provide some insight, but keep it short and focused as much as possible while providing some unique and differentiated content. And so while I could talk all day about this topic, I'm sure no one on the webinar wants me to do that. So today we're going to focus on precipitation. And current customers know that we like to talk in terms of weather data from a crop production weighting perspective, and we're going to do it again today. So for those that are new, I want to make sure we introduce this concept. And the idea is within crop production weighting is we'll take temperature for an Argentinian or a Brazilian map, and we'll weight the individual microregion or departmental level data based on how much crop is produced in that microregion compared to the overall national production. On the left-hand side here, we have soybean average production as a percent of national production for Brazil. The regions with the deepest green grow the most soybeans in Brazil. And so we see Mato Grosso is the dominant state within Brazil. And the key, though, is that when I present crop production weighted statistics, it is weighted based on basically the color of green shown on the map. And it allows us to take what is a potentially complicated map with different amounts of weather or temperature, or different amounts of precipitation or temperature relative to normal, and boil the analysis down to a single number that helps simplify the interpretation of the map. And so an example of that is shown here. So this is going to come up again, but this is Brazilian soybean production weighted precipitation over the last 90 days. And it can be thought of as on average how much rain has the Brazilian soybean crop received, in this case, since roughly the beginning of September. So a lot of the content that we present and a lot of our analysis is based on crop production weighting. So to jump right in, planting started in sometimes as early as late September, certainly through October. Again, we're going to look at some planting progress data for Brazil, but let's take a look at precipitation for October, November, and December. On the far left, we see for October of 2025, generally dry conditions across much of Brazil and South America. So Brazil soybeans was 73% of normal in October, and first season corn was 68%. So certainly that's a good chunk below normal. Argentina, I actually think the Argentinian precipitation as a percent of production or as a percent of normal is actually lifted a little bit by the Buenos Aires province precipitation that has happened. So a lot of Argentina was quite dry in the month of October. Likewise, in November, we see an improvement in Argentina, generally continued dryness in much of Brazil. And so those 2 months combined in Brazil created a little bit of discussion around weather risks in Brazil. And not to say that they're not eliminated yet, or at least I'm not going to say that until we get to the forecast component. But we see year to date in December, Brazil is now above normal precipitation through 8 days, whereas Argentina has turned rather dry as well. And so we're going to end up talking about two contrasts of a dry Argentina and a relatively wet Brazil as we look forward. And so we can use the crop production weighting statistic to take a look at a time series of the data. So left-hand side, we have Brazil soybeans over the past 90 days. Right-hand side, we have Argentina soybeans. Uh, Again, in Brazil, we see this developing dry scenario, although in the last few days of the data, Brazil has turned towards wetter and is starting to dig out of the dryness hole. If you attended our summer US webinars, I pointed out that in these types of charts, we provide this 90% envelope in the observed data. So this gray envelope that's here is 90% of prior observations fit within inside the gray envelope. And I use the outer edges, or if the data is outside that gray envelope, it's a pretty significant and pretty extreme event. We do see here that the precipitation right towards the beginning of December started to exceed this 90th percentile envelope. So it's in the driest 5% of the prior approximately 30 years of data. But as I mentioned, the precipitation is starting to dig out of that hole. In Argentina, the soybean crop is generally oscillating right around normal. So we see interspersed precipitation here amongst dry periods. And so just to drill in a little bit further, there was discussion around the rainy season in Brazil developing late and potentially impacting crop planting as well as the end of season yields. And so I think this 180-day view of the precipitation gives a good view on the ability to analyze whether the rainy season is developing late. So as the line cruises across July and heads into September and October, we see the slope of the line in the top graph increase pretty substantially. And that is, in fact, the normal development of the rainy season. And so any yellow that occurs in the graphic is suggesting that not as much rain as normal would occur. So is there a delay in the rainy season? So for sure, the rainfall is below normal, but it's not like it hasn't been raining. Again, is it significant? I think given the forecasts that we're going to look at, wild dryness is certainly something to be considered about. A lot of ground is going to get made up in the next couple of weeks. So Mato Grosso, certainly there was a delay in the development of normal precipitation. We can go to the north. We can go to the northeast to Tocantins. We see the establishment of another dry scenario. Again, this one exceeds this 90% envelope in early November during the planting period. And then we can go to the south at Mato Grosso do Sul, and we see an extended dry period developing. Looking at Argentina, we can look at the corn crop. So the corn crop and the soybean production-weighted precipitation look very similar. So again, near normal conditions across much of Argentina for rainfall, driven in large part by the extreme rain that occurred in Buenos Aires province. So this event here around the 4th of November created pretty substantial flooding in Buenos Aires province and certainly damaged the crop there, possibly causing replanting there. If we take a look at Cordoba, right, the breadbasket of Argentina, there is a developing and extended dry period there. So we haven't reached this 90% envelope exceedance yet. We're about halfway there. But certainly this is a condition to be watching given the amount of crop produced in Cordoba. So we can take a look at Brazil planting progress. And so here is first season corn data. This comes from the Ministry of Agrarian Development and Family Farming. The purple line is last year, the red line is this year, and the two other lines there are the two prior years to what we have marked. So there's not a lot of data here, but it does give us a good sense that for first season corn, I would say planting progress is largely on track. So there's no big surprises here. And what I think is interesting, if we shift to soybeans for Brazil, there were some news reports around late planting occurring in Brazil. It wasn't clear if they meant late planting, relative to a bunch of prior years, or late planting relative to the prior year, relative to the 24-25 season. But either way, given the limited amount of data, I don't see any emergencies occurring in the planted progress here. The risk of soybean planted progress in many of these states is that it delays the second season corn. And then the second season corn doesn't have as much time to reach full yield, and therefore second season corn yields are impacted. So that's why Brazil planted progress is closely watched. The biggest delay in soybean planted progress is here in Maranhão. And so we see this year so far is pretty significantly delayed. But as we see, the percent of national production is just under 3%. So it's not a huge risk, even if this delay materially impacts yields there. Just out of curiosity, I wanted to show this graphic right again in the U.S. summer grain analysis. We showed some analysis of weather and how it impacts the crop progress data. And so here is a chance where, in this case, we're showing the precipitation accumulation relative to normal against the Brazilian soybean planted progress for Maranhão. And it appears that the dry conditions, in fact, created the planting delays. And we see here, even where the drier than normal conditions are starting to be reduced by excess precipitation, we see that the planting progress increases. And so the good news is that weather in South America, or at least Brazil, also impacts planting progress data. And we'll be able to do more analytics on that down the road. So if we look at soybean and first season corn planted progress, the soybean is at 90% nationally. And the Maranhão is delayed, but not substantially. And so it's not unusual to be near 40% for this time of year. And the same for the first season corn. The number is very low, but it's not unexpected for this time of year, given the data that we just looked at. So the summary of this graphic is that the first season corn and the soybean crop is essentially planted. And now we spend the next couple of months watching weather conditions to see how well the crop might develop. So we can take a look at the weather forecast. So if we look at the ECMWF in Brazil for days 1 through 7, so the 1 week forecast and then the 2 week forecast, we actually see a good slug of dry conditions. Although for Brazilian soybeans and Brazilian first season corn, we see greater than normal precipitation, undoubtedly related to the excess precipitation here in southern Brazil. And then if we shift to the 2 week forecast, we see a very large area of above normal precipitation expected, with the production weighted percent of normal being well above normal in this case. And then if we can look at the AIFS, so the ECMWF model that I just showed, that's the physics-based models that have been around for a very long time. This is ECMWF's AI-based model that is based on, as the name would suggest, artificial intelligence-based techniques rather than physics. We will see a graphic that shows there's reasons to watch the AIFS forecast, and the forecast is not largely different. Wet in the south, dry in north and central Brazil for the first week, and then the pattern shifts to wet over much of Brazil. If anything, the AIFS is slightly drier, but still substantially forecasting precipitation for northern Brazil. Shifting to Argentina, we see in the 1 week forecast continued dry conditions across important parts of Argentina. The percent of normal for production weighted precipitation remains well below normal. And then as we shift to the week 2 forecast, there is some recovery where we see near normal, largely driven by the forecast in the precipitation forecast in Buenos Aires province. So this is again the ECMWF physics-based model. And if we transition to the AIFS, the thing that I notice when I look at this is the percentages are a little bit lower, and in particular in the 2 week forecast, the Buenos Aires province above normal shifted to below normal. So the two models have a divergent solution, and again, Buenos Aires province is a large producer for Argentina. So again, this forecast is potentially worth watching. given that there's a sort of a headline forecast that we're going to look at further of continued dry conditions across Argentina. So I have visited a few customers in the past couple of weeks, and one of the things that has come up is discussions around how are the models performing. So we're going to reach a section of the webinar here where we're going to dive into a lot of data and we're going to get a little technical before ending on the long range forecast. So I like to examine this kind of graphic that I call the forecast error waterfall. And what it shows is on the y-axis, the date the forecast was issued, and then the date the forecast was valid for. And then the color in this waterfall is the error of that forecast. So this is a precipitation forecast for Brazil production weighted soybeans from the ECMWF. And what the way to read this is as you go, for example, up this red bar, this is how accurate was the 14-day forecast to the 0-day forecast for the same valid day each time. And so in the case where there is a red vertical line, where there is a red vertical line like that, we see the forecast here was consistently too dry just up until a few days before the event. So notice that this was an excess precipitation forecast. It was consistently too dry. And then if we go one more, here is forecasts that for much of the forecast were consistently too wet. If you were to plot this data on an XY axis and by lead time, what you would see is on average, the excess precipitation events are under forecast and the low precipitation events are under forecasted. And that has some importance for interpreting the models and reacting to them in real time. We can then compare the models across the different models so that we have the ECMWF, the AIFS, which is the ECMWS AI model, and the GEFS. And so we can see, for example, the GEFS has a fair amount of brown compared to the ECMWF, and the AIFS is somewhere in the middle. Now, this is sort of hard to interpret, and certainly I'm just foisting this on you guys here in the webinar for the first time, and it's useful to provide some summary graphics. So to start, we can look at the recent precipitation forecast performance for each of the models that I mentioned, plus the single run GFS model. And the way this is 3 panels. So the leftmost panel is the 14-day averaged bias for the 1 to 5 day forecast, and then the 6 to 10 day forecast in the middle panel, and the 11 to 14 day forecast. So for example, in one of the discussions during a customer visit, there was a comment that the ECMWF seems to be wetter than normal across much of Brazil. And so in this case, we see that just recently, there was a positive bias. So the 0 line is here. So the bias is consistent. In this case, it's consistently forecasting too much precipitation in the 11 to 14 day period, averaged over 14 days. And just recently, then we see that the bias has come down and actually turned negative to where the forecasts tend to be too dry. So this is 14-day average soybeans for bias. And then this is corn 1, so first season corn production. If we take a very long average, say if we average a year's worth of this data, we want all of these lines to end up at 0. And the first thing you do when you want to improve a forecast is you want to remove a long-term bias because it's a fundamental error in the model. So this gives us a little information about how the models are performing. Bias is one measure. In this case, we are now looking at the mean absolute error, and that's basically you take the absolute value of the data of the difference between the forecast and the observed, and you calculate the average. And so you want a low number. A low number is better than a higher number in this case. And this allows us to evaluate the overall performance of the models. And what we see is the AIFS model is basically the leading accuracy model for precipitation. And generally for any lead time, and I'll tell you for any averaging period, on average, the AIFS tends to be the most accurate model. And so that's why I was showing the AIFS forecast earlier, and it makes that Buenos Aires province forecast worth considering because it shifted to drier than normal, whereas the physics-based ECMWF was wetter than normal. And now we can look at Argentina as well. Again, the biases oscillate around zero. We see some pretty dramatic changes from wetter to normal to drier than normal biases. I shouldn't say normal, excuse me. We see wetter biases to drier biases in the 11 to 14-day period in both corn and soybeans. Again, there's quite a lot of overlap in those two regions, which is why these two graphics look similar. And then in the mean absolute error statistic, in this case, we see the ECMWF physics model and the AIFS are sort of neck and neck in forecasting the two, in forecasting Argentinian production weighted corn and soybeans. And then across the board, generally the GFS model, which is it's a single ensemble. It's produced, comes out early, but it is the least accurate in terms of understanding what's going to happen with precipitation in the near future. So we have been experimenting with a new idea, and it's forecast volatility. So we've seen that forecasts can get released, and there's price changes that occur in the futures market. So it's worthwhile to track weather forecast volatility with the idea of trying to identify periods where the weather forecast might be more likely than other times to change from one run to the next or from one day to the next. So it turns out that we recently released a new product, and it is an API that provides 8 years of crop production weighted 0Z and 12Z ECMWF, the available AIFS data, GEFS and GFS forecasts. And so as you can imagine, this is 8 years of twice per day, daily updated forecast and full ensemble resolution. It is a lot of data. To boil it down to workable data volumes, we've calculated the forecast history in terms of Brazil soybean production weighted precipitation and temperature forecasts, or Argentinian corn and soybean weighted temperature and precipitation forecasts. And so what I want you to envision is that we have historical forecast data from 2017 to 2024, and then there's real-time forecast data for 2025. And so a forecast is volatile when the runs change a lot from day to day. And so we examine a 2-week period, and we examine a 2-week period, up to today for this year relative to the same 2-week period over the prior 8 years. And we can calculate then the standard deviation of the accumulated 14-day precipitation for variables like Brazil soybeans or Argentina soybeans for this year and for all given years. And just to give an example of this data, this is the 2025 daily change in the 15-day accumulated precipitation. So this is from January 1 to today, actually. And we see there are times when there's not a lot of changes in the forecast, and we see there's times when there's quite a few changes, particularly around the sign, around zero. So that's a particularly volatile time. And so a forecast volatility index is then the standard deviation of the day-to-day precipitation changes over the prior 2 weeks divided by the average of the day-to-day precipitation changes over the past 8 years. And it answers the question, how volatile are recent forecasts relative to prior years? So are forecasts today changing more than they have in the past? And the key is that it identifies periods when the forecast might be particularly volatile and when the market might be more willing to respond to the forecast change because the forecasts are volatile. So we can look at the volatility forecast index for Brazil for crop production weighted indices. And interestingly, we see, for example, for Brazil soybeans, the precipitation forecast is slightly just below normal volatility, whereas first season corn is slightly above normal volatility. So this chart is relatively uninteresting, in part because the volatility is largely near normal for precipitation for the major crops within Brazil. We can turn to Argentina, however. Oops, sorry. Just to highlight then, we can also do this for subregions. So for the state of Mato Grosso, we see the volatility is actually lower than the overall Brazil volatility. So this suggests that relative to normal, the forecasts for Mato Grosso are relatively consistent in terms of precipitation volatility over the past couple of weeks. And then turning to Argentina, we see the numbers are larger. So for Argentina soybeans, a volatility index of 1.5 means that the forecasts are 150% more volatile than they are during the prior 8 years. And the same thing for corn. So whereas Brazil's forecast is relatively stable from day to day, the Argentinian precipitation forecast for soybeans and corn seems to be relatively volatile compared to prior years. And then we can look at Cordoba as well. So Cordoba, the volatility is even slightly higher than it has been in the past couple of weeks. All right, so now we're going to turn towards the long-range forecast. And from this, we're going to use data from the World Climate Service. So we are going to look at the 3-week lead and then the 4-week lead. So the 3-week lead, this is for, interestingly enough, the Christmas week in South America, but 22nd of December to the 28th of December. And then the 4-week lead is the 29th to the 4th of January. I want to highlight that this is probabilities here and not anomalies. And so the areas in green are increased chances of above normal precipitation occurring in Brazil. And the areas in brown are increased chances of below normal precipitation. And so this pattern looks similar to what we saw in the 2-week forecast. Generally wet in the northern portions of Brazil, generally dry across southern Brazil and much of Argentina. And then we see the signal becomes weaker, which should be no surprise for a 4-week forecast compared to the 3-week forecast. This dry signal lingers, suggesting, again, it's worth watching to see if we end up with what will be almost 4 weeks of dryness across Argentina. And then the white areas here mean that the forecast remains uncertain. This little brown, this little green area makes me think that the models are leaning ever so slightly towards wetter than normal conditions. So the idea then is that the pattern that has set up is likely to occur into the 3rd week and is worth watching to see if it occurs into the 4th week as well, because it sets up a pattern of wet Brazil, which would be very positive for the soybean and the first season corn crop, but a dry Argentina, which has the potential to be detrimental to the corn and soybean yields there. So we would like to find if there is some confirming information about this forecast. And so to do that, we are going to turn towards what's called the AAO, the Antarctic Oscillation Index. So for those of us that live in the Northern Hemisphere, we are very lucky to have a lot of land, which creates disturbances in the atmospheric circulation and sets up different teleconnection patterns that we can use for long-range predictability. So ENSO is one of them for sure, but many of us have heard of, hopefully, of the Arctic Oscillation or the Pacific North America pattern. And it's these atmospheric patterns that get set up, exist for relatively long periods of time and allow us to gain some predictability into the weeks in advance. In the Southern Hemisphere, there's very few. And one of the best is the Antarctic Oscillation. And it is the Southern Hemisphere equivalent to the Arctic Oscillation in the Northern Hemisphere. And so we see a subseasonal forecast of the AAO currently being well below normal and staying below normal through to the 5th of January. And so we can generate an analog. We can look at what happened in the past when the AAO was negative around the 8th of December. And so I've done an analog for a negative Antarctic oscillation around the 9th of December during a La Nina. So we're also happen to be in a weak La Nina right now. And so I set this up such that we're looking at the 7 days ending the week of December 28th. And so this is key because this is the same week as the 3-week forecast that we looked at in the previous slide. And what I see there is the analog suggests dry conditions across Argentina and wet conditions in very northern Brazil. Now, the fact that there is low probabilities of wet conditions in Brazil and with a few dry peeking in here, means that again we should continue to watch for dry conditions three weeks in advance. The way I'm using this is the dynamical model is one signal of what might happen in the long range, and then this analog is another signal. Certainly for Argentina, the dry condition signal, is confirmed, and it provides a little bit more confidence for the dry conditions in Argentina. And then I think the wet conditions that are here in northern Brazil helps to confirm that wet, long range wet, but maybe not as strong as the Brazil forecast. And so, in summary, whereas the season started off being dry for October, November across much of Brazil, it was dry in Argentina, except for Buenos Aires province. We're seeing a potential pattern shift in Brazil, such that the forecast over the next couple of weeks is plenty of precipitation in much of Brazil, except for the southernmost states of Brazil. And then we're shifting to a pretty consistent dry pattern across Argentina as well. And so the planting is in. We're now in what is entering a key phase of the crop for both Brazil and Argentina. And these precipitation patterns will help determine the outcomes by the end of the season. That's all that I have prepared for today. As I mentioned, I want to keep it focused on precipitation for brevity and keeping it concentrated on an important risk. And I hope this information was useful to you. And if there are any questions, I will do my best to answer them, or I'll do my best to defer them until later and answer them via email. All right, I don't see any questions coming in the Q&A, and I don't see any lights in the chat. So with that, I will close out the webinar. You can always email us with questions about the content that I shared, and we will do our best to get you answers. Thanks very much for attending, and we hope the information was valuable.